Thank you very much. It's good to be with everybody. Uh, Jeff Dice talk was excellent. It's a great sort of introduction to one particular thing that I wanted to talk about. He was talking about the corruption of language and how we can get this top-down distortion of what words mean, and how we really are in a battle, in a sense, to maintain the definitions of some words and the use of some words against like what this establishment would want, against what the state would want. And so, excellent intro into what I wanted to talk about, sort of a big overview. I want to talk about one particular word that has been corrupted. It has been taken over by the state and by academia, by the establishment. And also, similar to the last talk that I gave, uh, I don't know if it was this conference or if it was a different event that the Discord server was having. I was basically just disagreeing with George Selgin. And so that's also what I'm doing this time. I'm disagreeing with George Selgin. So very recently on New Year's Eve, actually, George Selgin, he was quote tweeting somebody, and it had to do with Keynes on inflation. And it was a guy who was Austrian was saying that Selgin was basically uh, conceding the battle over the definition of the word inflation. And so Selgin said the refusal of certain Austrian economists and their fans to define inflation the way everyone else has been defining it for decades is stupid. He says, in general, if you have to depart from words received meanings to make a point, you haven't made a point. And then some people responded. I'm glad they did. Sometimes I will spar with George Selgin. Sometimes I let everybody else do the work. But so later on, he was responding to Econ Bro, and he said there are certain things for which popular opinion is definitive, and words definitions are one of them. To dismiss appeal to the dictionary as an appeal to authority is just more of the I guess he has a typo, just more about which my original tweet eliciting the reply below complain. So basically, Selgin is saying, guys, we got to just accept the meaning of the word inflation. And so, if I'm sure you're familiar with the common definition of the word inflation these days, it's an increase in prices. And that's basically it. So anytime somebody uses the word inflation, you can just sub in. It's a synonym for increase in prices. And what's interesting is that that's actually a more recent change from what it was even just a few years ago. But before this modern version, an increase in prices, it used to mean a general increase in prices. So like what you might think of as an increase in the price level, increase in CPI, increase in the PCE price index. And so there's actually been an even more recent change. And a good evidence of that is sometimes you'll see people talk about like wage inflation or energy inflation or healthcare inflation or education inflation or like a higher education inflation. And so basically what they're just using the term inflation to refer to an increase in the price of something or an increase in prices in a particular sector or industry. So that's a very recent change. Even since when a lot of the people we read were writing. So like even when Mises was writing and Rothbard was writing, they were combating the semantic change in the definition of the word inflation, but they were fighting a different battle than we are today. And in fact, it's gotten worse today. So it's actually devolved even more since then. And so I guess the point of this talk is basically to convince you that change or the changes in the definition of the word inflation over the 20th century and even recently in the 21st century is bad. We should fight against it. We should try to hold on to or keep using the term inflation to mean what it originally meant. Then I'll talk through the evolution and the reasons why in a bit. And but just to call back to what Jeff Dice was just talking about, the reason why is because it's not for tribal reasons. It's not just because, oh, I'm an Austrian and therefore I'm going to argue for whatever Austrians say the definition of a word is. That would be a bad reason. And so the reason I suggest is that the original definition of the word inflation was more specific. It was clearer. It meant something very particular, and it pointed to particular causes and also its effects, and like the particular effects of that cause, the increase in the money supply. Whereas over the course of the 20th century, the term inflation came to mean, or it came to mean the effects of inflation. So like the increase in the price level, and that was it. And now, of course, there's been this further devolution that I mentioned, that it's just any old increase in prices. And so if we're going to have clear thinking about what the central bank does, about what the government does, about the economics of all of this, like what are the consequences of increasing the money supply? What are the consequences of deficit spending, debts? How does the macro economy function? All of these sorts of things. Then we need to have the clear definitions of these words so that we'll have clear thinking about what we're trying to explain. Okay, so like I said, disagreeing with George Selgin here. You might be familiar with a paper that I wrote with Christopher Hansen about the definition of the word inflation. So the title is "What is Inflation? Clarifying and Justifying Rothbard's Definition." And in this paper, we did a bunch of different things, but we were basically just trying to argue that there were some slight differences between Mises and Rothbard on the definition of inflation. Mises held that inflation was an increase in the money supply that resulted in, or as a consequence of that, there was a decrease in the purchasing power of money. Rothbard, however, had a more specific definition of inflation that had to do with the amount of paper or amount of fiduciary media in excess of specie, or in excess of the base money. And so, I mean, they are similar, but there are some slight differences. And in this paper, we make the case that Rothbard's definition is easier to work with, and it's because it's more specific. It's easier to outline what the problems are. Where do the distortions actually come from? One, in a footnote in this paper, we say, our intent in this article is not simply to launch a war over words. It is to point to an important distinction between free market and privileged money production. It is probably futile to attempt to convert the world to our definition of inflation. We will be content if people accept the distinction. We can then qualify the term inflation with coerced or interventionist to make our meaning clear. So the idea is that, like, the point is not just to reclaim a word for the sake of reclaiming the word. And in fact, we're pretty pessimistic about the ability for Austrians in general to be able to completely change the national or global conversation, the way the words are used. Although, I mean, it's possible. But the point is not just to get the word for the sake of reclaiming the word. The point is to have clear thinking about the concepts involved. And so my argument is that the best way to have clear thinking is to keep using, it's basically to resist this, resist the corruption of the term inflation that's happened over the years. Okay, so why? I have a paper that I've been working on that will go into a book that's being edited by David Howden. And in this paper, I'm basically just going over Mises's view of inflation and Cantillon effects. And I have a section on the definition of inflation. I tried not to do too much overlap with what I did with Christopher Hansen in the other paper. But Mises considered the term inflation as it's already being lost, even in Mises's time when he was writing Human Action. So Mises says, the semantic revolution, which is one of the characteristic features of our day, has also changed the traditional connotation of the terms inflation and deflation. What many people today call inflation or deflation is no longer the great increase or decrease in the supply of money, but its inexorable consequences, the general tendency toward a rise or fall in commodity prices and wage rates. This innovation is by no means harmless. Notice that the innovation that he's talking about is just the change in the definition of the word. Like, what do people mean by the word inflation? He said that innovation is by no means harmless. It plays an important role in fomenting the popular tendencies toward inflationism. So Mises was saying that because the definition of the word inflation has changed, that in itself has had some bad effects. By the way, just as an aside, there's a great paper by an economist. The last name is Bryan. He's a Richmond Fed economist, and he wrote a paper. This was in 1997 about the way that the word inflation has changed over time. And he even though he was part of the Richmond Fed, he actually said it's bad what has happened. We've lost clarity. We've lost the ability to understand the effects of changes in the money supply because of this semantic revolution, as Mises called it. So for Mises, inflation is an increase in the quantity of money that is not offset by a corresponding increase in the need for money or the demand for money, so that a fall in the objective exchange value of money must occur. So notice that his definition, I was quoting from Theory of Money and Credit in that for his definition. In that definition, he's got both a cause and an effect. So he has both in there. And so the cause there is an increase in the quantity of money, and the effect is so that a fall in the objective exchange value of money must occur. So it's plenty capable of helping us figure out what's going on in the economy, what's going on with prices. It's the way that the term inflation has evolved over the years has not added more clarity. It's divorced the cause from the effect, so that we can just talk about changes in prices, and really anything can cause a change in prices. Any change in preferences, the change in the supply of goods, services, technology, availability of natural resources, anything can cause a change in prices. And so if we just start calling all the effects of all of those inflation or deflation, then we've lost clarity. Like if anything can be or cause inflation, then what is the point of that term? Like, why not just go back to the original way of describing what's going on, which is an increase in the price of something or a decrease in the price of something? Okay, so what did Mises? Give me 1 second. What did Mises say is like the problems? Like what were the problems with associating inflation with just an increase in the prices? And so he says that. He points out two reasons why he called it a newfangled connotation results in or supports inflationism. He said, first is that it's impossible to fight a policy you cannot name. He says inflation goes on luxuriantly while economists, commentators, politicians, bureaucrats, and the public quibble over what means what and what causes what. And so we have debates over semantics that detract from the debate over the policy itself. So one effect of changing the definition of inflation to mean just a change in prices in general, or an increase in prices in general, is that now we have this war over words, which I'm participating in today, by the way. So now we're fighting over what words mean, and more not just like fighting over what should mean what, but there's this added confusion to our debate. And so now a lot of time is spent. Jeff Dice talked about economizing our language. Now we have to waste a bunch of words, waste a bunch of speech and time debating with each other, just over clarifying what we mean when we're using particular terms. And so Mises says that if we're doing that, then that detracts from the debate over the policy itself. That when we start discussing the meanings of words, then we're not talking about the dangers of inflation, right? So that's one reason why the semantic revolution over the term inflation has actually resulted in more inflation. It's because the people who are against such a policy are now at a disadvantage where we have to spend more words and more time talking about what we mean since the meaning of the word itself has changed. Secondly, I'm reading from my draft of this paper. Secondly, conflating the causes and effects of inflation invites politicians to address the symptoms, including higher prices, instead of the root cause, monetary expansion. This is most evident in the proposals for price controls to combat inflation. Mises notes that this starts an interventionist spiral that often leads to even more inflation. And so here's a quote from Mises, Human Action, page 420. Price ceilings reduce the supply of the commodities concerned because production involves a loss for the marginal producers. To prevent this outcome, the governments granted subsidies to the farmers producing at the highest cost. These subsidies were financed out of additional increases in the quantity of money. So what's the big picture here? So we have monetary expansion that results in an increase in prices in general. The public gets mad about that. And since the public is mad about it, of course, politicians feel the need to do something. And notice that the something that they decide to do, since the term inflation has come to mean an increase in prices in general, politicians are now invited to address the symptoms, not the cause. So now politicians impose price controls. And there's a great book, it's called 40 Centuries of Price Controls. That might not be the exact title. But basically, this is a very, very old story. For millennia, there's been this problem where there's been monetary expansion, debasement of the money, or coin clipping, what have you, even back in ancient times, and that resulted in unpopular increases in prices, and that resulted in the politicians, the kings, the lords, whatever, they would impose price controls. So like they would address the symptom of the problem as opposed to the cause of the problem. And Mises points out that by just addressing the symptoms, they actually make the problem worse because, as he points out in that quote that I read, if you impose these price ceilings that results in losses to in particular industries, those people get angry, they argue for subsidies, and then the subsidies represent another increase in government spending, which could be financed by increasing debt. The debt is bought by a central bank with an increase in the money supply. So you actually get, as a result of the politicians trying to address the symptoms of inflation, you actually get more inflation by the original definition of the word. And so I called it an interventionist game of whack-a-mole. So like just addressing the symptoms of inflation results in more inflation coming up. And of course, so I say Mises offered the blatantly obvious solution. This is one of the beauties of Mises, by the way, is that he was able to just like see through this charade, this circus of what's going on with politicians addressing the symptoms of inflation. And he just said, to do away with the consequences of unlimited inflationary policy, one thing only is necessary: the renunciation of all inflationary measures. Which that is tautological, but it's true. It's like, if you want to get rid of inflation, then you need to get rid of inflation. Like if you see if you see that the effects of inflation are very unpopular, the way to address it is to get rid of the inflation. And it's based on Mises's definition, the increases in the money supply beyond the demand for money that result in the increases in prices. So address the root cause. Like to get rid of inflation, you've got to stop inflating. You've got to stop expanding the money supply. And so just to call back to the where I started when I was talking about George Selgin's tweet, notice how it's very difficult with a changed definition of the word inflation. So inflation is unpopular. Okay, so what do you mean by that? Well, if people mean an increase in prices, and by the way, that is unpopular, well then if the voting public are clamoring for a solution to the inflation problem, then and everybody's interpreting that as people don't like the increase in prices, well then you get calls for price controls. That happens today. Like we saw that this past year, where there was these renewed popular calls for price controls. In fact, one of Kamala Harris's main policy proposals is that she wanted to federalize bans on price gouging. Not really sure like exactly what that would have looked like or how that would have been implemented. But like that policy proposal was offered as a response to the unpopularity of price inflation, we'll call it. So like we see this interventionist game of whack-a-mole happening even today. It's not something that just applied to ancient Rome. Okay, so that's why Mises said we should hold on to the. He didn't say it in so many words, but that's why Mises said the original definition of the word inflation is better. And so I would add, let's try to hold on to it. Let's resist this change in the definition of the word inflation. Okay, so another reason why I think it's important for us to hold on to the original definition is because the one that became popular in the 20th century, not the most modern one, but the one that became popular in the 20th century, especially under the auspices of monetarism and Milton Friedman, which was like the general increase in prices, Mises showed over and over again in all of his writing, not just in Human Action, but in all of his writing, he explained the problem with that definition, and the definition being an increase in the price level. And the main issue there is that there is no such thing as a level of prices. There is no like economy-wide number that you can come up with to describe all prices in the economy. And even if you could, I would argue it would be meaningless. And so the reason why is because we all face a different array of prices. So the goods and services that I will buy and might buy here in Auburn, Alabama, are different than the goods and services that you will buy and might buy in your area. And not only that, but the goods and services that I might buy here in Auburn, Alabama, are different from the goods and services that somebody else in Auburn, Alabama will face. So everybody faces their own individual array of prices. So the way that we should think about prices in general is on an individual scale. So like when you see somebody talking about the array of prices, I see this sometimes in Austrian literature as well, and I think there's some issues with it. I mean, most of the time it's used in an okay way. There's not like any serious problems. But the answer to there's no such thing as the price level, therefore we shouldn't look at CPI, and it's because there's a bunch of different numbers, and it's mathematically impossible to summarize all of them into one like statistical average. I know we have like indexing processes and everything, but the answer to the problem of the price level as there's a bunch of different prices, that's actually an insufficient answer, because that's actually ceding the ground that there aren't all of these there aren't all these arrays of prices that individuals face. I hope my point is coming across clear. I haven't really articulated this before. But so the common line that I hear Austrians say is there's no such thing as the price level. There's a bunch of different prices in the U.S. economy. It's actually even more difficult than that. There's actually another step that you can take to show why a U.S. price index is so far off the mark, and that's the fact that I don't even face all of the prices that are within the CPI. I don't face all the prices that are within the PCE price index. I face a very particular set of goods, like the goods that I'm thinking about buying, the goods that I'll encounter in the marketplace. That's a very small subset of all of the different prices that are in the U.S. economy. So I have my own array of prices that I face. Somebody else, my next door neighbor, has a different array of prices that they face, and then somebody in Alaska faces a completely different array of prices, right? So it's not just that there's no such thing as the price level; it's that there are as many arrays of prices as there are individuals. Okay. So that's one reason why Mises argued so vehemently against the change in the definition of the word inflation in his day and age. Now, one thing that this leads to, I really don't have enough time to talk about this thoroughly, but I'll at least just sort of introduce it. Maybe somebody can ask a question. The reason why the whole price level idea is so bad, whether it's used by Keynesians or monetarists, is that you lose the ability to think about dynamic price fluctuations. You lose the ability to think about particular prices changing before other prices changing. And this is I did a lot of reading about this yesterday and the day before. I've been reading about Keynes's rejection of Say's law, and what I'm trying to do. This is probably for some future paper down the road. I'm trying to see if like what was the nugget, like what idea was Keynes like actually trying to say was the refutation of Say's law. And so I've been reading Clower, Lanhufvud, Hutt, a great Salerno article called "A Simple Theory," a simple model of the theory of money prices, I think is the full title, where he talks about the money relation and the markets for a few different goods, and he shows how when there's any change in the market system, and the example that he goes through is an increase in the supply of a particular good, but you could also show it with a change in the supply of money in that paper. Well, what happens is that there are many different effects on many different prices, and all of those changes in prices are affected by or have their ultimate basis in people's values. And so, like, if you take like this a Keynesian approach of like aggregation, where you look at like total spending, or even if you look or think about something like average wage or something like that, then you can get in. You can actually model. You can think through this thought experiment based on the assumptions in the model, the definitions of the words. You can arrive at Keynes's conclusion where there's like it's impossible for this economy to get out of this unemployment slump, and the reason why is because there's insufficient demand for the outputs, which means that firms can't hire enough workers. And so like it's very similar to the monetary disequilibrium theory idea, like the who goes first problem, that firms can't hire workers because there's not enough demand for the output, but there's not enough demand for the output because there's so much unemployment and workers can't buy the stuff that firms are producing. So like one thing that I've honed in on is like what actually causes that result? Like what allowed Keynes to come to that result? And so far what I found, I think the answer is he had no way in his models for particular prices to change. He had no way for a worker to say, you know what, this isn't really working out. I'm going to go into to this potential employer, and I'm actually going to offer my labor for a wage that's below what everybody else is doing. There's no way for a worker to go to another potential employer, but since he has this like very aggregate view of the labor market and a very aggregate view of output in general. In fact, one version of this unemployment problem, I saw a model of it where there was like there was three markets. There was a market for labor, a market for widgets, and a market for money. And so you had these three different markets. And what was interesting about it is that the author, I think it was Baird was the name. It was in a textbook from the 80s, I think. He was showing how you can still maintain Say's law and get Keynes's result of this unemployment problem. And when I was going through that problem and I was reading Hutt, it became clear to me that the issue is that they thought Keynes and Keynesians and monitors, by the way, they thought that all prices had to fall together or increase together. And if you have that as an assumption, like all prices have to change together, then you can get like these crazy dislocations. You can get persistent unemployment. You can have all sorts of problems in the economy. But as Hutt points out, a great book called Rehabilitation of Say's Law, he shows that no, if you have the prices of particular things changing, like if you allow wages to fall before output prices fall, then you can very easily emerge from these sorts of problems, and that's what happens in the market all the time. So the economy does this all the time. So it's sort of it's weird to think, or it's hard to understand how that assumption crept into the mind of economists that all prices have to change proportionally and simultaneously. But it was a pernicious error, and it caused all sorts of problems, as I'm sure you're aware. Okay, so all of that, just to remind you of like the overarching theme here, all of that has to do with the change in the definition of the word inflation over the years. And so we should go back to the way that Mises used it, or the way that Rothbard used it, or the way that it just appeared in dictionaries at the turn of the century, which was an increase in the supply of paper money, or increase in the supply of banknotes in excess of specie. So thanks, everybody.
All right, thank you. I will go ahead and ask the first question here. How does our definition of inflation impact the way that we view business cycles, and specifically the idea of credit expansion and things like that?
Great question. So one thing that it allows you to do is it allows you to separate out the different effects of changes in the money supply. So one thing that like all Austrians have embraced the idea of Cantillon effects. In fact, I can't believe I didn't even use that term in what I was just describing there at the end of my talk. Austrian business cycle theory is just a subset. It's a particular type of Cantillon effects that happens when the increase in the money supply comes through credit markets first. So if you have an increase in the money supply that enters the economy, it enters people's holdings through the loan market first. Then you have this depression of the interest rate. Loan rates go below the social rate of time preference, and then you have all these distortions to the way entrepreneurs are making production plans. So that's like one line that you can go down. So, but another way that you can proceed from that definition of inflation is, well, what if it doesn't enter the economy through credit markets? What if it's just like it enters people's wallets as cash, or their bank accounts as consumers? And so what you would get is a simple inflation where everybody runs out, buys a bunch of stuff. There would be distortions. There would be non-neutral effects, but you would just get this increase in prices. You wouldn't necessarily get this artificial boom that's followed by an inevitable bust. So that's the benefit of it, is that if you start with the monetary expansion and then you start to clarify, well, how does the money come into the economy? Then you can sort of like list out all of the different effects of inflation. It's not just an increase in prices. It's not just Austrian business cycle theory, or I guess I should say it's not just a business cycle in the Austrian sense. It's not just Cantillon effects. It's not just the government grows in size and scope. It's not just there's this disincentive to save. It's all of these things. So it really allows you to spell out and outline all of the different consequences of monetary inflation.
We got another question here from I'll give this one a try. Liberalissimo Doctrinario, I think. I might have butchered that. I think that was right though. He said, he says, do you agree with Rothbard's criticism of the quantity theory and money equation in Man, Economy, and State?
Yes. Yeah, I do.
You care to elaborate?
Yeah. So, if I, it's been a while since I've looked at it, but if I remember correctly, like one of the main issues for Rothbard was the velocity of circulation. Like there is no such thing as like an independent velocity of circulation. There's no, that doesn't enter into anybody's decision to act in a certain way. So like one thing that, as an analogy, one thing that Keynesians talked about is that there's this marginal propensity to consume, that like you take in a certain amount of income and then you can figure out how much of that income they will use on consumption, how much they'll save, and then depending on whether we're in equilibrium or out of equilibrium, will savings equal investment, so on and so forth. So basically they're saying like there's this marginal propensity to consume that's a given, and then we can figure out what consumers will do if we give them a certain amount of income, or given a certain amount of income. So I view the velocity of money in the same sort of way, which is that there is no like independent velocity of circulation. It's something that is only a calculated result of these huge aggregates. So like if you have prices and output, whether you're using all goods and services or just final goods and services, and you divide that by the money supply, then you get velocity. And yeah, it's fine to think about it as like the turnover rate of the money. Like how many times did the money supply have to be spent in order to achieve that total spending? Like even that way of phrasing it is rough. Like it's not really achieving total spending. Like how do you get it? How do you get one side of the equation to equal the other side of the equation? Which means, so what that means is that you can't describe what's going on in the economy by reference to a change in velocity. And the reason why is because velocity is not a cause of anything. There's no like conscious, I'm going to do my part to increase the velocity of circulation today. Nobody is out there thinking I'm gonna slow down V today, and also there's nobody saying I'm gonna make sure that I maintain the velocity of circulation of money today. There's no such like motivation or impetus to somebody's actions or exchanges that looks like that at all. So what actually happens? People have a certain stock of money. People see certain goods for sale out and about in the economy. People have a certain stock of goods themselves. They have the capacity to work. They own some land. And based on their valuations of the things that they own versus the things that they see other people owning, then they'll enter into exchanges with other people. And those other people also have values over their own goods and the goods that you own, which means that you get this exchange between the two people that's completely based on the stocks of goods that they own and the values that they have over the units of the good in question. So that's what explains prices, and that's what explains spending, by the way. So it's not, going back to what I was saying about the Keynesians, it's not like people have in mind, I'm going to spend X percent of my income. I mean, people might do like some budgeting sort of thing, but even when they're making those budgeting forecasts, they're thinking about the prices that they're going to face. They're thinking about the goods and services that they're going to need to provide for their household over that period, right? So even when they're thinking about budgeting, if they're thinking about, I'm going to spend X amount or X proportion of my income, even then they're still thinking about prices and values before they make that sort of plan. In any case, it's just a plan. What actually determines whether or not an exchange takes place is whether or not you have the double coincidence of wants over the money and the good or service involved. So spending is just a result. This is something that I've been chatting with Joe Salerno about for a while. A lot of people, I even hear Austrians do this sometimes. A lot of people will say, if there's an increase in spending, that serves to drive up prices. And that sounds so innocuous. It sounds so straightforward. It sounds nice, but that's wrong. What happens is first prices are realized. First you have an exchange take place. And then after the exchange takes place, you have a price and a quantity. So suppose I buy 2 units of good at $10 a piece. That's $20 total spent. Notice that first you have to have the exchange of the good and the money, and then you can calculate what the spending is after the fact. There wasn't like this sort of like amorphous, abstract like spending that was exuding from me, and then there was some spending from other people exuding from these like disembodied souls or something like that. And as a result of all of the different mixtures of spending flows, that resulted in an array of prices for goods. And then we can average out the all of those different prices and say that that's the price level. No, what actually happens is there's a double coincidence of wants. There's an exchange that happens. You can figure out what the exchange ratio is, which is the price per unit times, the price per unit, and then multiply that by the number of units that were sold, and you can calculate spending. So actually, it's that prices are determined first, logically and chronologically, by the way, and then there's spending. Spending is a passive result. It's a great. Let me see if I can find it really quickly. Great quote from Hutt. I believe it's in the same book, Rehabilitation of Say's Law. Give me 1 second. It's so good. Here it is. So this is on page 65 of Rehabilitation of Say's Law. He says it will help to, let me skip a little bit. Spending is incidental. If prices in general rise, then in such transactions as must be made through spending, an increased number of money units must be offered for any quantum of non-money. Each price established represents what must be spent if a good is to be sold and purchased. The increased spending is then a consequence, not a cause. It is the valuing process, not the spending, in parentheses, which follows the valuing, that determines prices. And then he has a cool example. He says, the truth of this proposition is established by the fact that all present prices are influenced by expectations of future prices. Another proof is that the prices of goods often change in a market which is closed for a period during which no spending on the goods could have occurred. So it's like we've all seen, like certain quoted prices will change even before the market is opened. So like even before the doors are open to a particular market, people are still, bargaining. They're still, doing all their higgling. They're deciding, I'll pay this much for this many units, and somebody says, no, you can pay this much for that many units, and so on and so forth. So prices are actually changing before the market even opens, even before the money changes hands. So in that sense, it's not just a logical. It's not just logically true that prices precede spending. It's also in a chronological sense. The first thing that's established is the price, and then the spending occurs.
All right. Well, before we let you go here, do you have anything that you want to plug, and where can all the people here find you at?
So I write for the Mises website, so you can find me at Mises.org. I'm also on Twitter. Come follow me there. Have a good time. Take some jabs at George Selgin here and there. In terms of things to plug, it's not out yet, but I think it's okay for me to say my third children's book will be out soon. It's a kid's book version of What Has Government Done to Our Money? And I think the title is going to be The Magic Coin. Yeah, the title is going to be The Magic Coin. So like there's this Rothbard coin that's like a genie that takes a little girl through the history of money and how it evolved, and also how it was corrupted by government. So take a look at that when it comes out. Thank you, everybody.
Awesome. Looking forward to it. Thank you very much, Dr. Newman.